In this video, I'll cover the major types of quantitative research designs. So when we look at our steps in the research process, we're assuming that at this point we've chosen a topic, we've reviewed the literature, we've used that literature review to help identify a need for future research, and to basically come up with a research question or hypothesis that we'd like to test, which, as you can see in the diagram here to the right, should drive the research design. We should determine whether we want to do a quantitative or qualitative study, and then more specifically what type of design. And we'll talk about some specific types of quantitative designs in this video. And the research design, which dictates how we collect data and what data we collect and when we collect it, will determine our procedure for data analysis. And then that obviously leads to the later steps of collecting and analyzing data and reporting findings. So what is meant by research design? Research design refers to frameworks for how to set up and conduct a study. For example, what type of data am I collecting? Is it going to be words and qualitative information, or is it going to be numbers, i.e. quantitative information? What variables should I measure? How should I organize my participants into different study groups, and if so, how should I do that? Am I going to intervene or control certain variables, or am I just going to sit back and observe certain variables passively? And finally, am I going to observe over multiple time points or only once? So these are just some examples of some considerations to make when you go to design your study. And really, it's the aims of your research that should drive the type of design that you choose for your study. So as a researcher, you may want to deeply understand a social phenomenon from the stories of individuals. As you can probably tell from our earlier conversation about the differences between qualitative and quantitative research, this very first aim that you see here is geared more towards a qualitative study. Aim number 2, you may be interested to find cause and effect relationships between variables. So does some intervention X lead to some outcome Y? You may be looking for correlations between variables, so not necessarily a cause and effect, but what happens to some outcome Y when some other variable X either increases or decreases. You may be interested to examine whether there are differences in different subpopulations of people, for example, males versus females, people in different age categories, people of different races, people with different behavioral characteristics. So for example, smokers versus non-smokers, people who are physically active versus people who are sedentary, or things of that nature. You may be interested to describe the current state of something by surveying a large number of people. And finally, just as another example, you may be looking for changes over time or across different life stages. So basically, how do people develop at different parts of their life? So this is a concept map showing the different major types of designs that we'll look at. So starting at the top, so you have research that can be subdivided into either qualitative research or quantitative research. We'll hold off on qualitative until another lecture. For today, we're just going to talk about quantitative. So quantitative studies can be subdivided into either non-experimental studies or experimental studies. Experimental studies can include pre-experimental, quasi-experimental, true experiments, small n, or single subject studies. And we'll talk about each of those in another video at another lecture soon in this course. Today I want to focus a little bit more on the non-experimental categories. So that type of research is subdivided further into either descriptive studies, correlational studies, or ex post facto studies, and descriptive is even further subdivided into observational and survey studies. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of these and also cover what is meant by cross-sectional studies and longitudinal studies and some of the different types of longitudinal studies in particular. So with experimental designs, the researcher controls or manipulates one or more variables. And in so doing, this makes it possible to establish a cause and effect relationship. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, there are several types of experimental designs, which I'll cover in another lecture. Next, I just wanted to point out some of the criteria for establishing a cause and effect relationship, but mainly I just wanted to highlight one of these in particular. I don't expect you to memorize this list. I just wanted you to be aware of something called temporality. So temporality refers to whether the cause happened before the effect. And the reason that I'm highlighting this, and the reason it's important in terms of what we're learning in this video, is that in an experimental design, you can be relatively certain that the cause happened before the effect because you, as the researcher, are imposing and manipulating the variable that you're purporting to be the cause, and making sure that that happens before you observe the outcome that you're expecting to be the effect. With other types of research designs, in other words, with non-experimental research designs, you can't be certain that the cause happened before the effect. You don't know in what order the variables are happening, so to speak. So I just wanted to make that point before moving forward to talk about non-experimental designs. So with non-experimental designs, the researcher does not control or manipulate variables, and as such, it's not possible to establish a cause and effect relationship. There are, as I said before, a couple different subtypes of non-experimental designs. One of those is descriptive studies, which are further subdivided into observational or survey studies. So in an observational study, just as an example, maybe you're going into classrooms or going to sporting events and you're taking down some observations. You're actually like writing down what you're seeing, which may sound like a qualitative study, but the difference is that whatever it is that you're recording is being quantified. So for example, you might be counting something, you might be rating the quality or the severity of something on a scale from 1 to 10, for example. In a survey study, you are using a questionnaire. So maybe it's on paper, maybe it's over the phone, maybe it's online. You're using the questionnaire to examine the current conditions, cultural practices, skills, experiences, demographics, etc. of a group of people. So for example, maybe I want to know about the best practices used by physical education teachers currently. So I might administer a questionnaire asking them, how often do you use, and give them a whole list of different classroom practices. Ask them about their demographic characteristics, ask them about their experiences working with other faculty or how they're treated by their administration or different things like that using a questionnaire. So questionnaire or survey studies, I should say, often require a large sample of people in order to quantify some of these different things in terms of the current conditions. Another subtype of non-experimental designs would be correlational studies. In a correlational study, the researcher examines linear relationships between variables without intervening. So you're just collecting a set of variables and you're basically looking to see if there's a linear relationship. As you increase one, does the other also increase or does it decrease? So for example, I might be interested in looking at the correlation between playing time and fun in youth soccer. And maybe there's a positive relationship there. Students or children who get more playing time also have more fun, right? Well, it could be that they think that it's more fun because they get more playing time, or it could be that they get more playing time because they find the sport more fun, therefore they're better at it and things like that. So it could be that there might be a correlation, but it's not clear kind of which variable is causing the other. As I alluded to earlier, we don't know the temporality of that relationship, and it could even be that there's a third variable, maybe just how good they are, that influences both whether they have fun and whether they get lots of playing time. And a final type of non-experimental design is what's known as the ex post facto design. It's sometimes called a causal comparative study. But again, I just want to emphasize that we still can't establish a cause and effect relationship with this type of study. And the reason is because the researcher has no control over the groups of people. The groups are whatever they are in real life, and the researcher is just coming in to observe, quote unquote, after the fact, which is literally what ex post facto means. So the researcher basically is seeking whether there are differences in already existing groups, such as between men and women, between smokers and non-smokers, between athletes and non-athletes, or just as another example, maybe we want to know if ice hockey players who have experienced a concussion are more aggressive than those who have not experienced a concussion. So again, that's not something that the researcher should be manipulating. Obviously, you don't want to give people concussions. That would be unethical. So you might just collect data on players who are known to either have or not have a concussion. So beyond the categorization of either experimental or non-experimental research, I also just wanted to cover another way of categorizing these studies. They can be either cross-sectional studies or longitudinal studies, and this either of these study types can apply to experimental or non-experimental research. In a cross-sectional study, you're observing at one time point. So both of these types of studies, cross-sectional and longitudinal, can be used to look at how people develop over the lifespan. In a cross-sectional study, you would basically be sampling people from all different age groups and basically looking to see what's the relationship between age and whatever outcome variable you're interested in. In a longitudinal study, you'd be observing over many time points. So you might be basically starting with a certain age of people, maybe 10-year-olds, and you actually observe them yearly or something like that up until they turn 22. So you basically have a range of ages from 10 to 22. But in this case, you're actually able to see how those individuals changed or developed on whatever outcome you were interested in over the course of those 12 or 13 years. So some subcategories of longitudinal studies. So a trend study is not like what I just described, but basically in a trend study, you would observe an age group yearly. Just as an example, you might be focusing on ninth graders, but you're basically observing ninth graders yearly, and therefore it's different students each year. So, ninth graders in 2015, then ninth graders in 2016, ninth graders in 2017, etc., just to examine how ninth graders as an age group change on a year-to-year basis. So how are this year's ninth graders different from ninth graders 10 years ago or something like that? In a cohort study, you're also not going to be observing exactly the same people, but you're going to be observing the same cohort of people over the course of several time points. So maybe over several years, you follow those ninth graders who were ninth graders in 2019, and then who are 10th graders in 2020 and 11th graders in 2021, et cetera, et cetera. So you're following the cohort, but there may be some individuals that enter or exit the cohort just because their family moves to another area or something like that, or you have people coming in because they've moved to the school that you have participate in your study. In a panel study, you're taking care to follow the exact same individuals. So you're making sure that the same individuals that I observe in 2017, I'm then observing in 2018, and then again in 2019, etc. So obviously you may have some individuals enter or leave the study, but you are actually paying attention to who the individuals are and linking their data from one year to the next to the next. A meta-analysis is a unique type of study. This wasn't covered in the concept map earlier, talking about the major types of quantitative outcomes, mainly because this is such a unique type of research. The researcher is basically seeking to aggregate and summarize the results from many different types of research studies on a particular topic. So it's basically a systematic review where the researcher does a thorough database search to obtain all the relevant studies, and then from those articles they extract a certain statistical outcome that they're looking to summarize, and they're taking those statistical results and entering them into a separate analysis known as a meta-analysis. So I just provided some examples from sport and exercise psychology. So there have been meta-analyses in the early, or the first decade of the 2000s, on cohesion and performance in sport and perceptual cognitive expertise in sport. So finding one of these on your research topic can be really useful because it can direct you to lots of different articles that may go into your review of literature for your thesis project. So finally, I just wanted to revisit this slide on how the different aims of your research should drive the design, just to go through some examples and test what you retained from the video. So go ahead and pause the video, read each of these, and see if you can match the aim to the specific type of quantitative design that I talked about earlier, except for number 1, which I already said was going to be a qualitative design. So go ahead and pause the video now, and then I'll go over the answers. So number 2, if you're interested in finding cause and effect relationship, you would need to use an experimental design. And we'll talk, as I said before, about the different types of those in a future video. Number 3, if you're looking for correlations, obviously that would be a correlational study. Number 4 is referring to existing groups of people. So that would be an ex post facto design. Number 5 would be best suited to survey research, as the word surveying implies in the statement there. And finally, number 6, if you're looking to examine change over time, then you would want to do something developmental in nature. You could potentially use a cross-sectional study, but probably a longitudinal study would be the way to go for that one. So the main takeaway here is obviously how to organize these different types of studies. So just refer back to the concept map on the earlier slide, showing that, and just kind of keep in mind how you can distinguish between especially experimental and non-experimental, and then how you can distinguish among the different types of non-experimental studies. So again, the main way to tell between experimental and non-experimental is whether the researcher is intervening and controlling certain variables in the study, which would make it experimental. And if they do that, there's the possibility to establish cause and effect relationship. If the research is non-experimental, then really there's no way to establish a cause and effect relationship.